I'm Aidan Koch, an artist working from Landers, California, the unceded ancestral land of the Serrano, embedded in the western part of the Mojave Desert. I want to start by thanking Hugh Frost and Matt Osmond for inviting me to participate in this conference. Despite the difficulty of staying engaged and educated in this time, I hope what I've formulated for you is interesting or relevant in some way. I've titled my talk, Repair as Relation, and will try and analyze for you how the form we know as comics is a generative tool for exploring different ontological relations, and how my own work strives to emphasize this. Meaning is developed through relations, by reading in sequence. Understanding or comprehension comes through tracking relations, patterns, characters, conversations, symbols, and other elements. These elements build meaning as context grows incrementally over the course of panels or pages. The interplay of text and image are the tools of instilling meaning. Ontology refers to the nature of being, including concepts of reality and existence. Different modes of being can be dependent on physiological, mental, cultural, and social differences for humans and other living organisms. Ontological dependence, in a broad definition, refers to shared existence in which beings cannot be extracted from their place among other beings. Their existence is dependent on all others, and one is not necessarily grounded in another, but must simultaneously come to be. The soil does not make the tree and soil make one another in a process of symbiotic conception. Anna Singh's Mushroom at the End of the World is a highly recommended example of this in its look at the wild mushroom harvesting culture and economy in the western USA and all the intertwining elements that create the necessary conditions for optimal mushroom growth and harvesting. Identifying relationships often means first identifying systems that dismiss and minimize relations. Coming from a lineage of Western and European art history, the type of framework offered by the medium of comics is unique in its emphasis of relationality as a driving means of understanding. I appreciate the word repair in this context as it refers to maintenance and the pre-existence of something. Depending on one's cultural history, the ability to see or assert these kinds of relationships have been masked by centuries of social and political forces. In Timothy Morton's Ecology Without Nature, he promotes that contemporary art, rather than historic, evokes what is often excluded in our view of the picture, its surrounding frame, the space of the gallery itself, and the institution of art altogether. In a very significant way, these experiments are environmental. By this, he means that historically, the art that we have access to and the way in which we are trained to view has been narrowed into singular images rather than seeing full context of particular works. It's worthwhile to expand one's awareness to the broader scale of relations, not just the ones we're expected or trained to see. These relationships have always been present, but are in need of repair and recognition. This can be worked towards by the culture of stories we consume and produce and how they ask our minds to see connections. This is a very broad theory of comics and one I'm working on clarifying. It is also one that can include other mediums like installation art or photography books, only I'm sure neither would necessarily self-identify with comics. So I thought what I'd do is just start kind of talking a little bit more about specifically how these ideas are incorporated in my work. And that's not to say that these things are very intentional in how I kind of have formulated stories, but almost that these concepts have been integrated as I've continued pushing the medium. And in relation to kind of my own just personal interests and areas of study. And I think these things have kind of worked together to build these worlds in which I'm constantly kind of considering beings and perspective. And yeah, that kind of dates back to some of my earliest work. So to talk about some of this, the formal qualities, the narrative qualities, the theoretic qualities, I pulled out a stack of my books. So I actually do come from a background traditionally in illustration and really foundations in drawing. And those have been, that was where I studied for undergrad, or that was the area I studied for undergrad. And I really found myself in comics because of the way in which it operates, which is so much different. And instead of kind of these single image based pieces, you know, something like a brand illustration or editorial, which are then kind of versions of content, the kind of integrated relationship of text and image, and really the complementary quality that these things carry in comics is something that just felt right in my practice. You know, and that's almost to say not that I was actually a really bad illustrator, and I think part of that was because I didn't understand how to incorporate everything in one image. And comics gave me this opportunity to explore things in a linear sequence. And, you know, even though maybe the narratives are non-linear, the ability to kind of read and acquire information throughout the reading process offered this opportunity to kind of lend a deeper understanding into various ideas, or really look into emotions and feelings and essence and kind of atmosphere, I guess. You know, it's very hard to portray atmosphere in a single image compared to something that's kind of morphing and changing and has a quality that is less easy to pin down. And I think sequence really gives that opportunity. So yeah, I'm gonna kind of just like go into some of these books, some older ones, some newer ones, and maybe even talk about the evolution of some of my work. So the first example, kind of just talking about the form of comics in terms of relation, I thought I'd share these zines' configurations and elements of painting, because both were really experiments in form rather than being focused really on content. And specifically, configurations was kind of a visual game of understanding. Literally how the way in which one configures a sequence can kind of inherently drive ideas of narrative. So when I was working on this, I basically just made a series of random drawings that I liked, and then decided to just create 3-panel comics out of that series of drawings, just kind of randomly selecting and arranging them in these sequences, and then giving each sequence a title. And I feel like what really happened is that the title kind of gave this clue to the reader as to maybe what is happening in these sequences, and kind of setting a tone. You know, on my side, there wasn't necessarily a great amount of intention in terms of what these narratives were. They were kind of just pairing general words that I liked, or and kind of images that I was drawn to. So, I mean, of course, they're not completely random in the sense that they're all driven by my personal aesthetic, as well as my kind of interest in language and dialogue. So they're, you know, stylistically, they're very representative kind of my own language and world. But in terms of the actual content of maybe what these like narratives are, they're extremely vague and up for interpretation by the reader. But there is this like natural compulsion to make sense of these. And I feel like, some of the response was actual interpretations by the audience in which they were kind of making guesses at what this story was. And in Elements of Painting, I looked at paintings, so single image works by artists. And in that case, I decided to kind of deconstruct and extract elements. So you don't see the whole painting, you don't see every part of the painting. Instead, I kind of narrowed in on very specific pieces within the single image work and put those pieces into panels within one structured, horizontal, rectangular frame. And what I was curious about was how doing this would shift the feeling of the narrative behind the works. Even something that was representing a full scene with multiple figures, multiple action going on, once you divide it into these panels, you kind of get this different sense of time, rather than taking it in as a single moment or kind of moments within one moment. I feel like the dissection becomes sequential, which then kind of becomes this idea of linear sequence, which then gives this idea of movement through time. And I feel like there was moments where there's certain ones in which it very much feels like it's portraying a larger narrative than even maybe just looking at the painting would offer you. As well as kind of playing off the fact that I feel like so rarely, even myself, when I go to museums or when I'm looking at paintings and drawings and kind of larger single image works, so rarely do I notice some of the finer details. And I found this for myself as a really interesting practice in looking at detail and looking at how detail and gesture offers clues kind of into states of emotion or states of action, and little hints at kind of what are some of the larger narratives going on within that work. So that was just a very kind of like practice for myself in not only looking closely, but also in studying kind of the ways in which the frame and the panel and breaking things up and fragmenting elements offers a different type of pacing or a different sense of movement, or just a new way to kind of interpret work. So these things were really helpful for me in my own process of kind of deconstructing the language of comics and sequence, which I then apply to narratives that are more directed and of my own kind of creation. So next, to kind of talk about more of this incorporation of this sense of being and kind of identity, I wanted to go into my book Impressions for a little bit and think about kind of how some of these formal concepts or kind of formal tools begin working their way into kind of the actual narrative approach. And specifically in Impressions, the main thing that kind of happens is there's this play in the way in which I draw the character kind of actually goes in and out of detail. Occasionally she's more kind of fully rendered as like her face and her expressions, and at other times she kind of appears more like a loose gestural painting. And even in other times, she's extremely fragmented, where it's only just kind of like her hair or the pattern of her clothing that becomes repeated as these symbolic representations of her, and kind of through these methods of kind of distilling her into these symbolic pieces, the reader is able to kind of carry through the idea of her as a consistent character. And kind of what this does is actually emphasize the reality of her subconscious experience as also her physical experience, and gets into this sense of how she sees herself, which is kind of the large arc of the story, and kind of this struggle that she's having in kind of self-determining her own agenda, and also how the artist sees her and depicts her. So, these eyes that are always kind of on her and what they see, as well as kind of how she sees herself through the artist's depiction of her. And these are kind of these different ways in which she's being rendered while simultaneously experiencing these forms of gaze. So, yeah, how, and the medium itself really creates a visual experience for the reader in which they're able to relate to her identity as this fluctuating version of self. And I kind of think of this not just as like a symbolic way of interpreting this internal struggle, because, when you really think about it, the way in which we move and interact in the world, and even how we kind of position or place ourselves, is very much in relation to how others see us. Whether it's, something starting as early as like how our family sees us, or kind of these, or society, these, seeing in terms of projection almost, that using this medium of comics allows us to kind of float through this fluctuation that I think, we all experience, kind of depending on the situations that we're in and the context that we're in at different times. I don't think that we're ever fully, one person. I think that it's something that's always kind of contextual. So Impressions was a book in which I really kind of looked at how one character could be experiencing, kind of multiple selves, or how I could really utilize different techniques to show this inconsistency of self, even though all of it is, the experience of one being or one human. So the next story I want to talk about is my most recent Spiral, which sadly at this time is only published in Spanish as La Espiral, but hopefully will be coming out soon also as an English edition. But this is my longest book actually yet, and it is one that contains two kind of, alternating narratives. One that is kind of between these characters, and specifically of one character who is kind of moving into this new chapter of her life, and she's kind of stopping with some friends and having kind of these moments of connection and evaluation and even nostalgia, and then alternating in between each kind of human story is the presence of a secondary narrative that kind of operates between each of the human chapters and is also ongoing. And this narrative is about two rivers that are converging and moving towards the sea. And so I mean, as the book kind of moves between these two stories, parallels grow in kind of understanding the metaphoric quality of, a human life and the river's kind of momentum, in this sense of time and kind of perpetual motion and speed that we feel of kind of just this movement ever towards greater ends. But within the human narrative, there's kind of these various discussions about like place and permanence and connection that I think are kind of rely on this kind of maybe thinking and learning with nature and natural forces. So, besides simply being this kind of metaphoric narrative, I also did try really specifically to allow the rivers to be characters in their own right, and to consider really how the idea of a river is not really like a totally solid concept. A river made up is water is made up of kind of particles or cells, and they're constantly in motion. The water you see at a waterfall, although maybe it's like that motion is constantly there, the same particles are not necessarily. And not only that, but a river isn't permanent, as we know so well in kind of our contemporary society. Water gets used, water gets moved, rivers get diverted, they get dammed. And there's so many external factors that kind of prevent this rhythm from existing permanently. So that was something I thought was interesting, and I think that there's something there to really think deeply about or to learn from, and to not take for granted. So I really wanted these two stories to kind of work together to build a dialogue about sensations of time and urgency and choice and connection, and even expression. And when I first started building this book, my original kind of ideas were in investigating conditions that marked basically the establishment of civilization. So some of it was kind of like agriculture or community or like permanent shelter and structures. And, those things are still in here for sure, but I also kind of started drifting through kind of some of the larger thoughts of these connections through kind of time and connection through environment, and really thinking in different perspectives of time. Trying to think of how might this river view changes in its path, or how might these things around us, the soil or the rocks, what is can we think of how they might perceive changes that are taking place around them. So I think in this case the form of comics really helped to express kind of the mood of these two stories, especially through the use of various mediums and abstraction and fragmenting, and even specifically in the water stories, all of the images are full bleed watercolors, so wet on wet, and that to me was really important in just kind of expressing the character of the rivers, so that it's not so much contrived, where in doing wet on wet, the pigment itself kind of made some of its own shapes, and I wasn't totally in control necessarily of like where it went or how it moved across the page. So that, yeah, that to me felt like kind of an important book in putting together these ideas. So the last piece I thought I'd share is my newest published work, Man-Made Lake, which is a short story published with Koch Comics. And the description for it is a story of psychoanalysis, being and becoming with. What happens and how do we cope in a world that separates us from our non-human kin? So to kind of talk about those ideas, the psychoanalysis, being and becoming with, I'll kind of describe the story a little bit. And even in the very beginning, we see this human shape and kind of in motion, and we watch as it morphs into a fish form, and then into the mind of a human attending a therapy session. And we can kind of take from this that this beginning sequence is either reality, past life, recounting of either of those things, or maybe a dream. We're not so sure about what this is, and I think by putting this within this structure of psychoanalysis or talk therapy, that it's really, I'm trying to think about kind of the coping mechanisms within Western society, and kind of like what we're presented with as forms to understand maybe trauma or various relationships or conditions under which we live, and just kind of some of the failures that exist within those offerings or those practices, in terms of some of the larger things that we're also all dealing with in our, that are kind of larger than just the individual human experience. So things like species loss or global warming or environmental degradation and development that, aren't always very directly affecting us, kind of depending on where we're situated, and what our, kind of what our privileges are or where we're coming from. But still have an impact on those who are kind of sensitized to these shifts in the worlds around us. So it's kind of a little bit of a critique of these methods, to not really fully incorporate or understand the complexity of this kind of integrated existence, as humans in this world that have had familial and kind of deep relationships with the earth. And so, the character, they kind of describe their having been a fish and the sensations that they experienced of connectedness, and how in their current form they're no longer able to access those feelings. And this I also see, is kind of related to experiences that many children have, kind of curiosity and boundaries that are really enforced by kind of societal pressures or cultural ideologies, including myself when I was younger. I remember having those experiences with my own family of being like, am I a boy or a girl? Like, can you explain to me why I'm one or the other? And even asking them, whether or not I could be a dog, and even, in acting, choosing as a child to act like a domestic pet for, I think, a week. just to kind of test that boundary and try and understand literally like what is the difference between me and, our pet dog. So these distinctions are really, enforced by the conditions around us. And, that I think, I'm not a dog. So there's that. But, you kind of have to, you rely on the culture, society around you to kind of tell you what things are. And, I think there is more ambiguous in my kind of experience or interpretation than what I've learned from from my education or kind of from other parts of society. So yeah, I mean, I think part of it is also asking like, so when you kind of maybe you're no longer a fish or a frog or a dog, does that then mean that you cut off relations with those other beings? Or, what happens then if you try and continue to communicate or strive to connect still? Whether or not that is something that you are. Kind of questions what value could exist in trying to maintain relations or connectedness. And yeah, I mean, one technique that I, to go back to kind of the more formal aspects I specifically used in this book too, was I used collage, I think for the first time, and I used fragments that were from a wildlife book. So, I use these forms of photographic representation, which I think often come up as a way of connecting, as a way in which we are looking and trying to see into the lives of other beings. That photography has really been this consistent mode with which we examine kind of otherness. And sometimes it's a very powerful tool for connecting. And other times, I think these are fairly dated books. They maybe enforce more kind of ideas of separation. So that was something I kind of wanted to integrate as something that kind of messed with these like ideas of entanglement and projection. Well, I think the general concepts of relationality and being can be explored through all variety of mediums. Comics has been an incredibly useful space in its allowance to move outside of boundaries, neither situating itself fully in written language or pictorial representation, even at times breaking its own panel framework. It can move around and describe complicated dynamics of relationships in sequence, without having to loudly or boldly state a firm position. Instead, it can use visual mediums to reiterate different ways of seeing, slowly suggesting a stance or provoking examination.